So last week I went over some spooky titles for the Steam Deck, not games that you would call outright scary, ones that probably land firmly at the mild end of the Halloween hot sauce spectrum, but this week I did want to ratchet up the intensity just a little bit and go over some older horror games for the Steam Deck. Now I would say that the games on this list are definitely more terrifying than what we went over last week, however I would also say that their fear factor is tempered just a little bit by nature of the fact that they are a little bit long in the tooth at this point, and every game on this list is at least 10 years old. But hey, the upside of a less technically taxing experience is that you're just going to get longer battery life anyways for some late night terror sessions. So with all that being said, let's just go ahead and dive literally into the first one, which is BioShock 2. I was really excited to jump back into BioShock 2 because for me, it's sort of the black sheep of the BioShock series. The original BioShock was pretty jaw-dropping at the time, and Infinite definitely expanded on the lore of the BioShock universe in like a massive way, but I think BioShock 2 still has its merits. In BioShock 2, you'll play as Delta, a Big Daddy, and after a chilling opening, you will reawaken to a rapture set in 1968 to deal with an entirely new antagonist, Sophia Lamb. And while I didn't find her to be quite as interesting of an antagonist as Andrew Ryan from the first game, it's still a convincing enough setup, and her philosophy is definitely a stark contrast to Andrew Ryan's more meritocratic leanings. Playing as a Big Daddy is a whole lot of fun in its own right. After eluding or dealing with them in the first outing, stepping into the very heavy boots of the hulking protagonist is a lot of fun. Grinding up splicers with your drill hand is pretty neat, and you've still got an array of other weapons and plasmids at your disposal. Not to mention the level design in these games is just top notch, not just artistically speaking with like this harrowing atmosphere, but mechanically they're also designed in a way that encourages a creative approach to combat. You can go in guns blazing if you want, or you could hack a security bot to create a distraction, or maybe you could just decimate an entire group of splicers from a high point by flinging an explosive barrel with telekinesis. The environment and your abilities just work in tandem to create a really consistently fun experience. But for all of the action, there are still plenty of chilling moments in BioShock 2. The City of Rapture feels like a character unto itself. Wandering through its dilapidated halls is more than a little bit unnerving with random ravings from hidden splicers and a string-heavy score that sets the tone. And I really like finding random audio logs just scattered throughout Rapture that kind of let the story progress without impeding the action, and they just gradually peel back more and more layers of the city's history and the fate of its denizens. Plus, at any moment you might have to go toe-to-toe with the deadlier and far more agile Big Sisters that are roaming around. It's all incredibly polished, if not somewhat undercut by the shadow of its predecessor, and I can't say for certain, but the BioShock series may have been one of the earliest examples of the baby child, big friend genre of gaming that's more popular today with games like God of War or The Last of Us. Deck performance is pretty top-notch, with only the occasional dip below 60 FPS whenever entering a new area, and even playing with your graphics settings maxed out, you can easily get around 4 hours of play on a single charge. And while the controls work just fine, I did end up remapping the jump button Y to the rear paddle just for better mobility. All in all, I'd say BioShock 2 is still way worth exploring, particularly if you're like me and just haven't revisited Rapture in some time. Next up is another first-person horror experience from around the same time, and I always thought it was kind of an underrated gem, but that would be 2005's Condemned: Criminal Origins. Set in the fictional city of Metro, Condemned has you playing as an FBI crime scene investigator, Ethan Thomas. Having been framed for murder, you'll have to explore a variety of seedy locations, examining evidence, and also fight off a range of psychos, predominantly through melee combat. There are firearms in the game, but they only ever have as much ammo as what was in them to begin with, so don't expect to be running around, finding ammo crates or anything like that. Now going back to Condemned, I really wasn't expecting that much because I had not played the game since like 2006 on the 360. And it definitely looks pretty dated by today's standards, but just because the game's graphics are outdated doesn't mean that it doesn't have any merit, but you should probably be ready for some pretty blocky character models. Now, as far as the crime scene investigation gameplay portion of Condemned: Criminal Origins, I wouldn't say it's the most riveting part of the experience. However, it does serve to provide a breather for the story and break up what does hold up well, and that would be the actual survival horror aspects. Clearing a dilapidated building of psychos is great fun because it's so tense. It's not the smoothest combat that I've seen, but it's serviceable enough, and it's extremely tense clearing some dingy basement when an enemy can pop out at any second and just crack you in the face with a pipe. There's not a ton of health pickups lying around these environments, so you'll definitely want to be careful not to engage enemies in a group because that's just a great way to get rocked really fast. Speaking of the enemies, the AI is pretty decent in that they won't always rush you full force. Sometimes they'll rush in just long enough to get a better weapon and then dart away to the shadows to lie in wait for an ambush. And considering a lot of the time you'll only have a flashlight to kind of clear an area and look for any danger, your eyes can definitely start to play tricks on you when you're trying to assess whatever threats might be just lurking in the darkness. And it doesn't help things much that there are more than a few creepy mannequins in this game. As for playing on the deck, I did have to adjust the resolution initially to 1200 by 800, and I also ended up seeking out a community layout for the controls that was a little bit more to my liking, and it definitely took a little getting used to. I also adjusted the sensitivity on the right analog stick a little bit, and it definitely took me some time to come to grips with using the investigative tools because they weren't quite as intuitive as just, swinging a 2x4 around. I would say Condemned shows its age worse than some of the other entries on this list, but at the same time, it still has its charm, so if you're looking for a survival horror sort of game with like a detective noir coat of paint, then I still think Condemned is worth exploring. And while we're on the subject of exploring creepy environments with a flashlight, next up is Doom 3. I first played this way back on the OG Xbox back in like 2004, and it was totally jaw-dropping from a visual perspective. Or rather, I should say that it would have been jaw-dropping if Chronicles of Riddick Escape from Butcher Bay hadn't come out a couple months prior and kind of stolen some of Doom 3's thunder, but honestly that's probably a video for another day. But for today's purposes, just know that Doom 3 still looks pretty good technically speaking, and it looks real good artistically speaking. And that's because it was a pretty sharp departure from Doom 1 and 2 and massively different from Doom 2016 or Doom Eternal. Doom 3 just feels like it was designed to be a horror experience first and a shooter secondarily. Sure, there are mainstays of the series like armor shards and demons and classic weapons to pick up, but make no mistake, the pacing in Doom 3 is radically different than any other entry. The closest analog I could figure would be Doom 64 with its darker, moodier environments, but even Doom 64 was way faster than what we see here. For starters, in Doom 3 you'll find an experience with a much bigger emphasis on storytelling, and then mechanically, instead of wide open spaces that kind of encourage a fast-paced ballet of death, here you'll be moving much more slowly, traversing lots of dark corridors, crawling through vents, and relying on your trusty flashlight to navigate all manner of demonic horrors that might be slinking around. Now the flashlight is a point of contention for some players because in the original Doom 3 you had to choose whether to wield the flashlight or your weapon, but you couldn't do both at once. However, in the BFG edition you can have your flashlight active at the same time, however it is temporary because you still need to recharge it now and again. Now some people thought this ruined the tension of Doom 3, but personally I think that's nonsense. Doom 3 is still plenty scary, and you'll definitely have a tough time balancing the slower pacing and choosing carefully when to reload your weapon and how to evade the horrors of hell in some very tight quarters. Performance on the Steam Deck is pretty rock solid, however a quick word of warning, do not try to enable anti-aliasing because for some reason if you do that, then it will just black out the screen entirely and you just can't see what you're doing. Also, I did explicitly have to tell it to use controller controls rather than keyboard controls whenever I was in the Doom 3 menu, but aside from those two minor tweaks, yeah, Doom 3 runs perfectly fine on the deck. So if you've played Doom before but never played Doom 3 before because you heard like, it's not quite as fast or it feels very different than the other entries, it does definitely feel different, but it's not bad different, and it's definitely worth a look if you're looking for a creepy experience that is heavy on atmosphere. And now for a somewhat lighter but no less rad experience about surviving hordes and hordes of the undead is 2006's Dead Rising. Dead Rising follows photographer Frank West and his mission to document a zombie outbreak over the course of 3 days. After getting airdropped into the local mall to do some investigating, you'll end up meeting up with a whole host of eclectic survivors and some very weird bosses to battle over the course of 72 hours. The twist here is that while you're constantly trying to complete missions and raise prestige points to upgrade your abilities along the way, the whole time you also have to keep an eye on the clock so that you don't miss your extraction on the final day. And to be honest, when I first played this entire mechanic was kind of a sticking point for me. Don't get me wrong, I love the tension of the race against the clock when Dead Rising first came out, but I also kind of hated it because when Dead Rising came out, it was one of the most visually impressive games that I'd seen at the time. But sadly, I never felt like I could really stop and smell the roses because the clock was always ticking. And it's way easy to get distracted in Dead Rising because it is just bursting at the seams with things to see and do. There are survivors to rescue and missions to do and photos to take and just like a million interactable objects from weapons to food to books that you can drop into your inventory and new outfits that you can find. But putting all these mechanics and systems aside, you still have to, not die in a zombie apocalypse. In short, I'd say that Dead Rising is just this overflowing, generous game, and while it's pure chaos at times, that's exactly what a zombie apocalypse would feel like, so it's all perfectly appropriate and has a ton of replay value. And deck performance was pretty much rock solid, running at 60 FPS without breaking a sweat, and it really just worked great out of the box with all the default controls. And from what I could tell, it looks like you could easily get 4 to 6 hours of playtime out of Dead Rising. So I would say as long as you don't mind the extra nuance of racing the clock while also trying to do all the stuff you need to survive a zombie apocalypse, Dead Rising is definitely worth a look, although it may drive you a little bit crazy if you're a completionist who just has to do everything. And the final entry on this list is one I actually debated including because it truly feels more like an interactive experience, a little bit more than a game, but honestly I thought it was so cool at the time that I could not include it, and that is Indigo Prophecy, or Fahrenheit depending on what part of the world you played that game in. And again, Fahrenheit definitely feels like more of an interactive experience than a game, but honestly that shouldn't be surprising considering it's coming from Quantic Dream, the same studio that brought us games like Heavy Rain, Beyond Two Souls, and Detroit Become Human. Even starting a new game of Fahrenheit doesn't say new game, it says new movie in the menu interface. In Fahrenheit you'll play as Lucas Kane, a normal guy who undergoes a particularly abnormal scenario. It kicks off with you in the bathroom of a New York diner holding a bloody knife while there's a dead body nearby. And much like Ethan from Condemned, it sure looks like you killed this guy. From here you'll jump into a cat and mouse game bouncing back and forth between Lucas and the investigators pursuing him, all of this while tugging at the threads of a greater, perhaps supernatural mystery. Now granted, it's pretty narrative heavy and a slightly dopey mystery in my opinion, but I still have to give this game props for going to such great lengths to try and tell a cinematic story. Switching back and forth between Lucas and some of the other cast members in Indigo Prophecy is definitely an interesting way to play out the story. It's a game mostly about dialogue choices, but it also has some environmental puzzle solving in a choose-your-own-adventure sort of way. And it is pretty cool seeing how choices play out from the viewpoint of the other characters in the game. There's also a lot of split perspective that happens whenever the game's doling out cutscenes, and it looks really slick. I don't know if I'd necessarily call it groundbreaking since we were seeing similar methods used in films around when this game came out, but it was definitely a clear indicator that more and more creators were looking to push the boundaries of what could be done in a video game from a storytelling perspective. It plays fine on the deck by default, but fair warning, I could not get into the settings to further adjust any of the graphical settings because every time I did, the menu would just sort of blink uncontrollably and then I would have to exit the game entirely to go back in. So I definitely wouldn't call Fahrenheit the most stable cinematic game that you could play this Halloween, but if you're curious about some of Quantic Dream's earlier work and you can find it on sale, it's still interesting as like this watershed moment for video game storytelling and something of a cult classic. Alright, and that about wraps it up for this one, and if I could only pick one game from this list that I thought you should try, it would probably be Dead Rising, just because it worked so perfectly, like, right out of the box, so to speak. Again, I know that I take some issue with like that constant race against the clock, but ultimately it's really fun, really wacky, and it still has some legitimate horror built into it. But hey, what about you? Are there any old horror games that you're looking forward to exploring on the Steam Deck this Halloween? If so, let me know in the comments below, because I would love to hear what your choices look like. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch these videos. I really appreciate it. Take care, and I'll see you next time.